Have you ever lost someone and instead of missing them, you started questioning yourself? You wondered, was I not enough? Did I fail? Was I the mistake? But what if I told you this losing you was the biggest mistake they ever made? Not because you're perfect, but because they walked away from someone God was still shaping. Stay with me until the very end, because the final truth might completely change how you see your past, your pain, and your purpose. Rejection has a way of getting inside your head before it ever leaves your heart. It doesn't just knock on the door of your emotions, it walks straight into your identity and starts rearranging the furniture. When someone leaves you, distances themselves, replaces you, or decides they no longer want you in their life, the pain is rarely limited to the loss of the relationship. The deeper wound comes from the silent question that follows you into every quiet moment. What was wrong with me? That question is dangerous because it assumes something that was never true, that their decision defines your value. Rejection feels personal, but it is not always purposeful. Many times, people reject not because you are lacking, but because they are limited. They reject what they cannot understand, what they cannot control, or what they are unwilling to grow into. And yet, the human tendency is to internalize the rejection and externalize the blame toward ourselves. We replay conversations, re-examine mistakes, magnify flaws, and shrink our strengths until we convince ourselves that if we had just been different, quieter, stronger, easier, more agreeable, more impressive, more patient, more forgiving, then maybe they would have stayed. But the truth is this: someone's inability to stay does not equal your inability to be worthy. There are people who will walk away from gold because they were only looking for something temporary. There are people who will abandon depth because they prefer comfort. There are people who will reject faith, vision, commitment, or growth, not because those things lack value, but because those things demand responsibility. And when they leave, the lie creeps in that says their exit proves your inadequacy. But rejection is not a verdict on your worth. It is often a revelation of their priorities. Think about how many times in life you wanted something desperately, only to realize later that it was never meant for you. Now reverse that perspective. Just because someone did not choose you does not mean you were not valuable. It means they made a choice based on who they were, not based on who you are. People choose according to their capacity, their maturity, their fears, and their wounds. Someone with unhealed pain will reject stability. Someone addicted to chaos will reject peace. Someone afraid of accountability will reject truth. Someone unwilling to grow will reject anyone who reminds them of who they could become. Rejection often feels like abandonment, but sometimes it is protection. Protection from becoming smaller to keep someone comfortable. Protection from compromising your values to maintain connection. Protection from delaying your purpose just to preserve a relationship. When someone walks away, it hurts because connection matters, but it also reveals something important. You were willing to invest in something they were not willing to sustain, and that is not a weakness. That is evidence of your capacity to love deeply, commit sincerely, and show up fully. There is a reason rejection feels heavier when you tie your worth to approval. If your value depends on being chosen, then every loss feels like a failure. But when your value is rooted in who you are and whose you are, rejection loses its power to define you. It still hurts, but it does not destroy. It wounds, but it does not erase. It disappoints, but it does not diminish. Because your worth was never theirs to give or take. Sometimes rejection is not about you being too little, but about you being too much. Too honest for someone comfortable with half-truths. Too committed for someone who wants options. Too driven for someone who fears change. Too emotionally aware for someone who avoids self-reflection. Too faithful for someone who only wants God when it's convenient. When someone rejects you for being who you are, the temptation is to edit yourself so you fit the next relationship better. But the truth is, you were not rejected because you were wrong. You were rejected because you were real. The danger is not rejection itself. The danger is what you believe after rejection. If you believe the lie that you are unworthy, you will settle for less than you deserve. You will tolerate disrespect, accept inconsistency, and lower your standards just to avoid being left again. You will confuse attention with love and proximity with commitment. But when you understand that rejection does not define your worth, you stop negotiating your value for validation. There is a powerful shift that happens when you stop asking, "Why wasn't I enough?" and start asking, "What does this reveal about what I deserve?" Rejection clarifies. It exposes misalignment. It removes distractions. It forces you to confront whether you were holding on to something because it was good or because you were afraid to be alone. And often, what you call loss is actually release. God never measures you by who walked away. He measures you by who you are becoming. He is not surprised by rejection, nor is he threatened by it. In fact, throughout Scripture, rejection is often the starting point of refinement. Joseph was rejected by his brothers before he was positioned for leadership. David was overlooked before he was anointed. Jesus himself was rejected by people he came to save. Not because he lacked value, but because truth is often rejected by those who benefit from illusion. If rejection meant worthlessness, then faith would be impossible, because faith requires trusting that what you cannot see still matters. And your worth is not something you prove by being chosen. It is something you carry whether others recognize it or not. The moment you let rejection define you is the moment you give someone else authority over your identity. And no human being was ever meant to have that power. The truth is, some people only know how to love the version of you that benefits them. When you grow, change, heal, or set boundaries, their comfort is threatened, and rather than rise to meet you, they leave. That does not make you difficult. It makes you dangerous to dysfunction. Growth exposes immaturity. Healing exposes toxicity. Strength exposes insecurity. And people who are unwilling to confront themselves will often reject the very person who reveals their need to change. Rejection feels like being unwanted, but often it is being redirected. Redirected away from dependency. Redirected away from self-doubt. Redirected toward purpose. When someone leaves, you are forced to stand alone long enough to hear God clearly, to see yourself honestly, and to rebuild your confidence without applause. That process is uncomfortable, but it is also transformative. You are not defined by who failed to see your worth. You are refined by what you learn when they leave. Rejection does not mean you were a mistake. It means you were not meant to stay in a place where you had to beg to be valued explain your loyalty, or prove your sincerity. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner rejection loses its grip on your identity. Because the truth remains, no matter who walked away, no matter who replaced you, no matter who misunderstood you, no matter who underestimated you, your worth was never on trial. It was never negotiable. It was never dependent on their decision. It was established long before they entered your life, and it remains intact long after they exit. Loss has a way of stripping life down to its core. When someone leaves, you don't just lose a relationship, a friendship, or a shared future. You lose a version of yourself that only existed in connection to them. And that is why loss feels so disorienting. It removes familiar patterns, emotional anchors, and daily affirmations that once told you who you were. Suddenly, the question is no longer about them. It becomes about you. Who am I now that they're gone? What do I believe when the voices that once surrounded me are silent? What remains when what was familiar is removed? This is where many people misunderstand God's role in loss. We assume that if God is good, He will prevent loss. But over and over again, Scripture and life itself reveal a deeper truth. God often allows loss not to harm us, but to reveal us. There are parts of your identity that can only be discovered when what you leaned on is no longer there. As long as certain people remain in your life, you may never fully see who you are apart from them. Loss removes the mirror you depended on so you can finally see yourself clearly. When someone leaves, it feels like something has been taken from you. But sometimes what is removed was never meant to define you in the first place. You may have unknowingly wrapped your identity around being needed, being chosen, being affirmed, or being included. And while those things are not wrong, they were never meant to be your foundation. God will never build your future on something that can walk away. So He allows the shaking not to punish you, but to reveal what cannot be shaken. Loss exposes where your identity was anchored. If losing someone makes you feel invisible, it may be because your sense of worth was tied to being seen by them. If losing someone makes you feel powerless, it may be because your confidence was rooted in their approval. If losing someone makes you feel directionless, it may be because your purpose had quietly become dependent on their presence. God does not reveal these things to shame you. He reveals them to heal you. There is a painful honesty that comes with loss. It forces you to sit with yourself without distractions, without roles to play, without expectations to meet, without someone else's opinion shaping every decision. In that quiet, uncomfortable space, God begins the work of rebuilding identity from the inside out. Not the identity you performed, but the identity you carry. Not the version of you shaped by survival, but the version shaped by calling. Many people stay in unhealthy attachments, not because they are good, but because they are familiar. Loss breaks familiarity, and familiarity often masquerades as identity. You get used to being the strong one, the one who understands, the dependable one, or the one who stays. And when the relationship ends, you don't just grieve the person, you grieve the role. God uses that grief to ask a deeper question. Who are you when you no longer have to play that part? Identity revealed through loss is often uncomfortable because it requires honesty. You begin to see patterns you ignored, compromises you justified, and boundaries you avoided. but you also begin to see strengths you didn't know you had, resilience you never tested, faith you never fully relied on, courage you never had to use. Loss reveals not only what you leaned on too much, but what God placed within you all along. There is a reason seasons of loss are often followed by seasons of clarity. When distractions are removed, truth becomes louder. You begin to hear God's voice without interference. You begin to feel conviction where you once felt confusion. You begin to sense direction where you once felt stuck. Loss clears the noise so identity can surface. Not the identity others assigned you, but the identity God intended for you. In Scripture, God repeatedly uses loss as a turning point of identity. Abram loses familiarity when he leaves his homeland before becoming Abraham. Moses loses status in Egypt before discovering his calling in the wilderness. Ruth loses her husband before stepping into a legacy she never imagined. Peter loses his pride before becoming a leader grounded in humility. In every case, loss precedes revelation. Something had to be removed before something greater could be revealed. We often pray for clarity without realizing clarity often comes through surrender. And surrender almost always feels like loss. Loss of control, loss of certainty, loss of expectations. But in surrender, identity is refined. You begin to realize that you are not who you were because of someone else. You were always becoming who God designed you to be. The relationship did not create you. It revealed parts of you. And when it ended, God continued the work. Loss teaches you the difference between attachment and assignment. Not everyone who walks with you is meant to stay with you. Some people are seasonal. They serve a purpose, teach a lesson, reveal a weakness, awaken a strength, and then leave. When you mistake a season for a lifetime, loss feels like failure. But when you recognize assignment, loss feels like transition. God removes people who were connected to a chapter so you can step fully into the next one without dragging the past with you. Identity revealed through loss is quieter, deeper, and stronger. It no longer depends on applause or affirmation. It is anchored in conviction. You begin to know what you stand for, what you will tolerate, and what you will no longer accept. You stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop proving yourself to people who already decided who you were. Loss frees you from the exhausting work of self-justification. There is also a sacred humility that comes with loss. You realize how much you depended on grace without recognizing it. You become more compassionate, more aware, more grounded. You begin to see others not as saviors, but as companions. You understand that God alone is your source, and people are channels, not foundations. That shift changes everything. It allows you to love deeply without losing yourself. It allows you to commit without collapsing your identity into someone else. God uses loss to teach you that your identity is not fragile. It can withstand disappointment. It can survive abandonment. It can grow through grief. What breaks you open does not have to break you apart. Loss cracks the shell around who you thought you were so the truth of who you are can emerge, not rushed, not forced, but revealed through time, reflection, and trust. When identity is revealed through loss, you stop fearing it as much. You still feel pain, but you no longer panic. You understand that what is being removed is not your future, but your dependence on what cannot sustain it. Loss no longer feels like God turning away from you, but God calling you deeper. Deeper into faith, deeper into self-awareness, deeper into purpose. And as painful as it is to admit, some relationships delay identity because they allow you to hide. Hide from growth, hide from responsibility, hide from the calling that requires more than comfort. God loves you too much to let you stay hidden, so He allows loss to pull you into the light. Not to expose you to shame, but to reveal you to yourself. Because when everything familiar is gone, and you are left standing with nothing but faith and breath, you begin to realize something profound. You were never empty. You were never lost. You were never defined by who stayed or who left. You were being revealed layer by layer, strength by strength, truth by truth, into the person God always saw when He called you His own. When someone walks away from you, it's easy to believe they walked away from the best you had to offer. It feels like they saw everything you were and decided it wasn't enough. But what if the truth is far more unsettling for them and far more hopeful for you? What if they didn't walk away from who you are, but from who you were becoming? What if they didn't leave because you were stagnant, but because you were changing in ways that no longer fit their expectations, their comfort, or their control? Growth makes people uncomfortable, especially those who benefited from the old version of you. The version that tolerated more, explained more, accepted less, and asked for little. The version that stayed quiet to keep peace, stayed small to keep connection, and stayed loyal even when it cost you yourself. When you begin to grow, something shifts. Your boundaries strengthen, your voice becomes clearer, your vision expands. And not everyone who enjoyed your old version will celebrate your transformation. People often say they want you to grow, but what they really mean is they want you to grow in ways that don't disrupt their access to you. They want growth that benefits them, not growth that changes the dynamic. The moment your growth requires them to adjust, to mature, to take responsibility, or to lose control, resistance appears. And instead of rising to meet you, some people choose to leave. Not because your growth is wrong, but because it reveals what they are unwilling to become. There is a version of you that people get used to. They learn how to predict you, manage you, and navigate around your limits. But when God begins to shape you into something new, predictable patterns break. You no longer respond the same way. You no longer tolerate the same behavior. You no longer prioritize the same things. And for those who only knew how to relate to the old you, the new you feels unfamiliar, threatening, or inconvenient. When they walked away, they didn't leave your future. They left your past. They left the version of you that was still learning how to say no, still learning how to trust God instead of people, still learning how to choose peace over approval, still learning how to stand alone without apologizing. What they walked away from is not what you are losing, it is what you are outgrowing. Growth often looks like loss before it looks like freedom. It feels like things are being stripped away, relationships are falling apart, and stability is disappearing. But what is actually happening is alignment. God is separating you from what no longer fits who you are becoming. And separation always hurts when attachment runs deep. But attachment to the old version of yourself is often the greatest obstacle to becoming who you are called to be. Some people cannot walk with you into your next season because they are attached to who you were in the last one. They remember your mistakes, your insecurities, your dependence, your fear. And when you begin to move differently, speak differently, believe differently, it challenges their narrative about you. Instead of updating their understanding, they cling to the past. And when you no longer fit the role they assigned you, they disengage. This is why rejection during growth feels so confusing. You are doing better, but losing people. You are healing, but feeling isolated. You are becoming stronger, but experiencing distance. And the enemy whispers that you are doing something wrong. But often, this is confirmation that something is finally changing. Growth disrupts comfort. Healing exposes dysfunction. Maturity ends unhealthy cycles. And not everyone survives those transitions. What they walked away from was a version of you that was accessible in ways that were unsustainable. A version of you that gave without boundaries, forgave without accountability, and stayed without reciprocity. As you grow, access changes. Availability shifts. Expectations rise. And for people who thrived on your overextension, your growth feels like rejection. So they leave, blaming you for becoming different, when the truth is you finally became honest. There is also a deeper reality that is hard to accept. Some people leave because your growth mirrors their stagnation. When you begin to pursue purpose, they feel exposed in their comfort. When you begin to heal, they feel confronted by their wounds. When you begin to believe God for more, they feel threatened by their lack of faith. Rather than confront what your growth reveals about them, they remove themselves from your life. But understand this clearly. Your growth is not betrayal. Your healing is not abandonment. Your boundaries are not rejection. You are not responsible for making yourself smaller so others can feel bigger. You are not required to stay the same to keep people comfortable. Growth is obedience to who God is calling you to become, not loyalty to who people prefer you to be. The tragedy is that some people only realize what they lost once the transformation is complete. They remember the version of you that struggled and assume you are still there. They don't see the discipline you developed, the wisdom you gained, the faith you built in the silence after they left. They don't see the prayers you prayed alone, the nights you chose growth over bitterness, the mornings you decided to keep going even when it hurt. They walked away before the fruit was visible, and that is often how it works. People leave during the process, but notice during the outcome. They exit during the planting and return during the harvest. But by then, you are no longer accessible in the same way, not because you are bitter, but because you are different, stronger, clearer, more rooted. You no longer chase what left you. You no longer beg for what walked away. You no longer measure your worth by who stays. Growth changes how you see loss. You stop seeing it as abandonment and start seeing it as timing. They were present for one chapter, not the whole story. They were there for preparation, not destination. And that understanding brings peace. You no longer resent their absence because you understand their role was temporary, necessary, but limited. What they walked away from is becoming visible now. Not in arrogance, but in alignment. You carry yourself differently. You speak with intention. You choose with discernment. You love without losing yourself. And while they may regret leaving, that regret does not validate your growth. Your growth was valid long before they noticed it. God does not reveal everything at once. He develops you in stages. And some people leave between stages because they cannot reconcile who you were with who you are becoming. They prefer the unfinished version because it felt safer. But you were never meant to stay unfinished. You were meant to grow, even if it meant growing apart from some people. The pain of being left often turns into the power of becoming. The energy you once spent trying to be understood is redirected toward becoming whole. The attention you once gave to fixing relationships is invested in building character. The love you poured into people who could not hold it is now rooted in God, where it multiplies instead of drains. What they walked away from is not just a better version of you, it is a truer one. One that knows who they are without needing permission. One that trusts God without needing consensus. One that moves forward without needing closure. And as painful as their exit was, it created space for this version of you to emerge, because becoming always requires leaving something behind, leaving comfort, leaving familiarity, leaving approval, leaving people who only knew how to relate to your limitations. And while they may look back and call it a mistake, you look forward and call it transformation. They walked away from the process. You stayed for the becoming. One of the most exhausting pursuits after loss is the search for closure. We convince ourselves that if we could just have one more conversation, one honest explanation, one sincere apology, or one clear reason, then the pain would finally settle. We imagine that clarity will come from their words, that peace is waiting on their understanding, and that healing is delayed until they acknowledge what they did or what they lost. But closure that depends on someone else is fragile because it places your healing in the hands of the very person who hurt you. Closure is often misunderstood as an external event, when in reality it is an internal decision. It is not something they give you, it is something you grow into. And as long as you believe closure comes from them, you remain emotionally tethered to their silence, their avoidance, their denial, or their indifference. You wait, you replay, you rehearse conversations that never happen. You analyze behavior that was never explained. And in doing so, you give power to someone who is no longer present. The hard truth is that many people never give explanations that make sense because they themselves do not fully understand why they did what they did. Some people leave out of fear, others out of immaturity, others out of unresolved wounds they refuse to confront. Expecting clarity from someone who avoids self-reflection is like expecting light from someone who refuses to open their eyes. Growth begins when you accept that their explanation may never come, and that even if it did, it might not heal what you think it would. What you call closure is often the desire to be validated. You want to know that your pain mattered, that your effort was seen, that your love was real, and that your loss was significant. Those desires are human. But when validation becomes a prerequisite for healing, you remain stuck. Growth teaches you how to validate your own experience. It allows you to say, what I felt was real, what I gave was sincere, what I lost was meaningful. Even if no one else ever confirms it, growth reframes the narrative. Instead of asking, why did this happen to me? You begin asking, what is this producing in me? Instead of replaying the ending, you begin examining the transformation. Growth shifts your focus from their behavior to your becoming. And in that shift, closure begins to form naturally, not because the story was resolved, but because you were strengthened. There is a quiet power in realizing that you do not need their permission to move forward. You do not need their agreement to heal. You do not need their remorse to reclaim your peace. Growth teaches you how to stop waiting at doors that have already closed and start building something new with the space that was left behind. It teaches you how to redirect energy from rumination to renewal. One of the reasons growth is so essential to closure is because pain without growth turns into bitterness. When you stay emotionally stagnant, unresolved pain begins to define you. It seeps into new relationships, distorts trust, and reinforces fear. But when you grow, pain becomes information instead of identity. You learn from it without living in it. You carry wisdom instead of wounds. Growth brings perspective that explanations never could. You begin to see patterns instead of isolated moments. You recognize red flags you once ignored. You acknowledge needs you once suppressed. You understand that some relationships end not because of one event, but because of long-standing misalignment. That understanding does not excuse the hurt, but it contextualizes it. And context reduces confusion, which is one of the deepest sources of emotional pain. As you grow, you stop romanticizing what hurt you. You remember not only the connection, but the cost. You remember not only the good moments, but the emotional labor, the compromise, the anxiety, and the self-betrayal. Growth gives you the clarity to see the whole picture instead of clinging to selective memories. And that clarity brings peace because you stop longing for something that required you to lose yourself. Closure through growth also means accepting unanswered questions without letting them control you. It means recognizing that not every chapter ends with understanding, but every chapter can end with maturity. Growth teaches you how to carry ambiguity without collapsing under it. You learn that certainty is not a requirement for peace. Alignment is. When you grow, you realize that some conversations would not bring closure, they would reopen wounds. Some explanations would not heal you, they would confuse you further. Some apologies would not restore trust, they would only soothe guilt temporarily. Growth protects you from chasing what would ultimately delay your healing. There is a subtle shift that happens when growth replaces longing. You stop checking for signs, messages, or updates. You stop interpreting silence as a message. You stop measuring your progress by how much they still affect you. Instead, you measure progress by how grounded you feel, how clear your boundaries are, and how consistently you choose peace over chaos. Growth allows you to forgive without reconciliation. It teaches you that forgiveness is about releasing yourself, not restoring access. You can forgive someone and still acknowledge that they are no longer safe, aligned, or necessary in your life. Closure is not reopening the door. It is understanding why it needed to close. As you grow, you also learn to grieve properly. Not just the person, but the expectations, the imagined future, the version of life you thought would happen. Growth honors that grief instead of rushing past it. It allows you to feel sadness without drowning in it. And as grief is processed, closure forms naturally because you are no longer fighting reality, you are integrating it. One of the most liberating aspects of growth is realizing that you do not need to be understood by everyone to be at peace with yourself. You stop explaining your side to people who have already decided what they believe. You stop defending your boundaries. You stop justifying your healing. Growth teaches you that silence can be a form of closure when words would only prolong pain. Closure through growth is gradual. It happens as you rebuild routines, rediscover joy, and reestablish trust in yourself. It happens as you choose healthier connections, make wiser decisions, and recognize your own resilience. It happens when you look back and realize the memory no longer has power over your present, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer defines you. There is a moment, often unnoticed, when closure quietly arrives, not through a message or a conversation, but through a sense of peace that surprises you. You realize you no longer need answers. You no longer need acknowledgement. You no longer need to revisit the past to feel complete. Growth has done what explanations never could. And perhaps the most important truth growth teaches you is this: closure is not about closing your heart. It is about opening it wisely. It is about trusting again without repeating patterns. It is about loving again without abandoning yourself. Growth ensures that what hurt you does not harden you, but it does sharpen you. When closure comes from growth, it is unshakable. It does not depend on timing, behavior, or regret. It is rooted in self-respect, clarity, and faith. You stop looking backward for peace and start carrying it forward with you. Because the real end of a story is not when someone leaves, explains, or apologizes. The real end is when you no longer need anything from them to live fully, love freely, and move confidently into what God is doing next in your life. When someone leaves your life, it can feel like the story stopped mid-sentence. You imagined a future that included them, planned around their presence, and measured progress with them in mind. Their exit doesn't just remove a person, it disrupts a vision. And if you're not careful, that disruption can shrink how you see your future. You begin to interpret what ended as a limitation on what's possible. You start to believe that because they left, something essential was taken from you. But the truth is far more expansive than that. Your future was never built on who stayed or who left. It was built on purpose, calling, and growth that no single person could contain. A future defined by someone's exit is a future trapped in reaction. It means every step forward is still influenced by what happened behind you. You make decisions trying to avoid repeating the past instead of pursuing what God is inviting you into. You protect yourself so tightly that possibility feels dangerous. But a future shaped by fear is not a future shaped by faith. God does not write your story around loss. He redeems loss into direction. People often assume that when someone leaves, they take momentum with them. But more often than not, their exit reveals where momentum was being restricted. Some relationships unintentionally cap growth because they require constant maintenance, compromise, or emotional labor that drains vision. When those relationships end, it creates space for clarity, space for focus, space for alignment. What feels like emptiness is often capacity being created for something larger. Your future cannot be small if God is involved, because God does not think in fragments. He thinks in fullness. He sees beyond moments, beyond heartbreak, beyond chapters that feel unfinished. When someone exits your life, it may feel like subtraction, but God works in multiplication. He uses what was lost to redirect energy toward what is next. not as a replacement, but as an expansion. One of the reasons their exit feels so defining is because pain narrows perspective. It pulls your focus inward, making the loss feel like the center of everything. But as healing progresses, perspective widens. You begin to see that your life is not a single relationship or season. It is a story unfolding across time, shaped by lessons, resilience, and obedience. The chapter that ended did not cancel the chapters that are still unwritten. There is also a temptation to let someone's departure become a reference point. You measure new opportunities against what was lost. You compare new relationships to what ended. You evaluate your progress by how far you've come from that moment. But when you do this, you give their exit authority over your direction. Your future deserves its own definition, not one borrowed from pain. Your future is too big to be confined to a narrative of abandonment. It includes growth you haven't experienced yet, wisdom you haven't gained yet, and purpose you haven't stepped into yet. It includes people who will meet you where you are becoming, not where you were. It includes opportunities that require the strength you're still developing. And none of that is diminished by who left. Sometimes we overestimate the role people play in our destiny. We confuse influence with ownership. People can walk alongside you, support you, and shape parts of your journey, but they do not own the direction of your life. God alone holds that authority. When someone leaves, it reveals that their role was never meant to be permanent. Their exit does not disqualify you. It simply clarifies assignment. A future defined by purpose is resilient. It adapts. It continues. It does not collapse when circumstances change. That is why God often separates you from people who would be unable to sustain the weight of where you are going. Not because they are bad, but because the path ahead requires capacity they do not have. Your future includes responsibilities, influence, and impact that demand maturity, discipline, and faith. God will not allow someone to remain in your life if their presence would hinder that growth. There is also a deep freedom in realizing that their exit was not a detour. It was part of the route. It taught you discernment. It refined your priorities. It strengthened your boundaries. It clarified your values. All of these are tools you will need in the future you are stepping into. Nothing was wasted. Even the pain was instructional. Your future is not fragile. It does not shatter because someone leaves. It does not lose meaning because plans change. It does not disappear because expectations were unmet. A future rooted in God is durable. It bends without breaking. It adjusts without losing direction. It expands beyond what you originally imagined. When you stop defining your future by their exit, you stop carrying unnecessary weight. You release resentment. You let go of the need to prove something. You stop trying to show them what they lost. Your motivation shifts from validation to obedience, from reaction to intention, from fear to faith. There will be moments when memories resurface and you wonder how things might have been different if they had stayed. But those moments do not negate the truth that staying would have required you to become smaller, quieter, or less faithful to who you are becoming. A future that requires self-abandonment is not a future worth protecting. Your future includes joy that is not dependent on anyone else's presence. It includes peace that is not threatened by absence. It includes confidence that does not rise and fall with approval. And that kind of future can only be built when you stop anchoring your identity to who walked away. God's plans are not reactive. He does not scramble when people leave. He does not adjust his calling because of human decisions. He is not surprised by exits. He weaves them into the story. What looks like an ending from your perspective is often a transition from his. As you move forward, your future begins to feel less like something you're recovering and more like something you're stepping into. You stop seeing yourself as someone who lost something and start seeing yourself as someone who is being prepared for something. The language changes, the posture changes, the expectation changes. Your future is not about proving them wrong. It is about becoming fully aligned with what God is doing in you and through you. It is about stewardship of your gifts, your time, your heart, and your faith. And that kind of future is not threatened by who leaves, because it was never built on them in the first place. When you look back one day, you may still remember the pain of their exit, but it will no longer define the meaning of your life. It will simply be one moment in a much larger story, a story of growth, resilience, obedience, and purpose that continued long after they walked away, unfolding into something far greater than you could have imagined, shaped not by loss, but by faith, direction, and a future that kept expanding beyond every ending. When someone leaves your life, it can feel like the ground beneath you has disappeared. The pain is real, the grief is heavy, and the questions are relentless. But the truth we've explored is clear: loss does not define you, rejection does not diminish your worth, and their exit does not determine your destiny. Every departure, every heartbreak, and every unanswered question is an invitation to grow, to step deeper into identity, and to embrace the future God has prepared for you. You have learned that rejection is not proof of your worth. No person's inability to value you reduces your inherent significance. You have discovered that God uses loss to reveal identity, showing you who you are when the mirrors you relied on are gone. You've realized that what they walked away from is what you're becoming, and that growth will often separate you from those who cannot keep pace. You've seen that closure doesn't come from them, it comes from growth, and that peace emerges not from explanations, but from your own transformation. And finally, you understand that your future is too big to be defined by their exit, because your calling, your purpose, and your destiny extend far beyond the limitations of any single relationship. The people who walked away were never the measure of your potential. They were a reminder that God's plan is bigger than the pain of the present. Their loss is the space where growth, clarity, and alignment take root. What feels like abandonment today may be the very thing that positions you for impact, influence, and freedom tomorrow. Your story does not end with who leaves, who hurts, or who misunderstands. Your story continues with every choice you make to grow, to trust, to heal, and to step into the fullness of who God created you to be. Every step forward is a step toward becoming the version of yourself that is unshakable, unbending, and unstoppable. So carry this truth with you. Losing you was the biggest mistake they ever made, not because you are perfect, but because the person they lost was someone still becoming, someone resilient, someone destined for more than they could ever imagine. And the same God who allowed their exit is guiding every step of your journey, shaping your purpose, and preparing a future far greater than you could have seen when the door closed. Your pain is real, your journey is valid, and your growth is unstoppable. Every ending is a new beginning, every loss is a lesson, and every step forward is proof that what was taken from you was never the measure of what you were meant to become.